King Lear is a tragedy. I like tragedies. I've never been a big fan of fiction work, but I'm trying to change that with this book club. Part of the reason I tend to neglect fiction is because most stories, at least in the West, seem to be pre-digested and formulaic. They lack a certain rawness and realism to them for the sake of fitting a mold of a prefabricated plot arc. This is why I tend to like tragedies. A good one, at least, seems to ignore any audience expectation and focus on the actual story and bitter realities. Most readers of King Lear today know that it is a tragic play, but I think many contemporaries did not know what they were in for. I think that would be a great way to experience Shakespeare, not knowing if you're going in for a comedy, a tragedy, or something else entirely. Act 1, Scene 1 opens with the Earl of Kent and the Earl of Gloucester discussing the king's unpredictable opinion of the Dukes of Albany and Cornwall. It may seem like an unimportant exchange at first glance, but I suggest that it is more significant than people may realize. I'll talk about why in a bit, but the opening also introduces the audience to Edmund, Gloucester's bastard son, with some spectacular lines. And as I continue to go through the play, I'll quote things that I enjoyed or find important, like how Gloucester explains that the child was born out of wedlock. "I cannot conceive you. Sir, this young fellow's mother could, whereupon she grew round-wombed, and had indeed, sir, a son for her cradle, ere she had a husband for her bed. Do you smell a fault?" The double play on words is something that you'll notice Shakespeare does quite often. Here, Kent states that he cannot conceive, meaning understand, but Gloucester retorts using the same word in the context of conceiving a child. King Lear enters to the sound of trumpets with a retinue and announces his intention to divide the kingdom of Britain among his three daughters, Goneril, Regan, and Cordelia, but first demands that each profess her love for him. Recognizing that he's aging, the king wants to retire from the burdens of leadership, but also secure the issue of succession now, as to avoid any civil conflict after his death. Goneril and Regan both make exaggerated and insincere declarations of love, but Cordelia refuses to indulge in the spectacle instead, and says that she loves her father according to her bond as a daughter only. It's also important to note that each daughter is attached to a male counterpart. Goneril is married to the Duke of Albany, Regan to the Duke of Cornwall, while Cordelia is unwed, but is being courted by the Dukes of France and Burgundy. Now, Cordelia's lack of flattery is not a lack of love, and in an aside to herself, she recognizes this by saying, "Then poor Cordelia, and yet not so, since I am sure my love's more ponderous than my tongue." And later she expresses the same sentiment in more colorful imagery by telling her father, "I cannot heave my heart into my mouth." Going one step further, she criticizes the speeches of her sisters and points out their contradictions by suggesting that they cannot love the king entirely while also being married. "Why have my sisters husbands, if they say they love you all? Haply when I shall wed, that lord whose hand must take my plight shall carry half my love with him, half my care and duty. Sure, I shall never marry like my sisters, to love my father all." There's a clear dichotomy established already between Cordelia and her sisters. In the one, there's sincerity, honor, and wisdom, while in the others, there's deceit, greed, and opportunism. Unfortunately, the latter get all the favor because, angered by Cordelia's lack of flattery, Lear disinherits her and further divides her share of the kingdom between her sisters. And I do really like the cruelty in the line spoken by the king here. "The barbarous Scythian, or he that makes his generation messes to gorge his appetite, shall to my bosom be as well neighbored, pitied, and relieved as thou, my sometime daughter." He's comparing his own daughter to barbarians and someone who would cannibalize their own child. I can't think of a more savage comparison, and he puts an exclamation mark on it by referring to her as his quote-unquote sometime daughter, or once was but no more daughter. The Earl of Kent tries to defend Cordelia and persuade the king to reconsider, but Lear is unwilling to listen and banishes Kent as well, telling him to come not between the dragon and his wrath. The crown is then physically passed to the Dukes of Albany and Cornwall. King Lear retains 100 knights to his service and plans to alternate his time between the hospitality of his two favorite daughters. As for Cordelia, the Duke of Burgundy no longer wants anything to do with her, does not want her hand in marriage, since she no longer comes with a dowry. The Duke of France, however, recognizes and appreciates her honor and takes her as wife with no dowry, and I think he has an excellent speech here. "Fairest Cordelia, that art most rich being poor, most choice forsaken, and most loved despised. Thee and thy virtues here I seize upon, be it lawful, I take up what's cast away. Gods, gods, it's strange that from their coldest neglect, my love should kindle to inflamed respect. Thy dowerless daughter, king, thrown to my chance, is queen of us, of ours, and our fair France. Not all the dukes of waterish Burgundy can buy this unprized precious maid of me. Bid them farewell, Cordelia, though unkind. thou losest here a better where to find. Goneril and Regan exchange a dialogue about their father's senility as the scene closes. It's worth going back now to the opening sequence between Kent and Gloucester. On a first reading, it may be easy to summarize the scene as King Lear asking his daughters to profess their love so that he can decide who deserves the most of his kingdom. I think, though, that this is completely misguided. The opening lines are, "I thought the king had more affected the Duke of Albany than Cornwall. It did always seem so to us, but now, in the division of the kingdom, it appears not which the dukes he values most, for qualities are so weighed that curiosity in neither can make choice of either's moiety." This heavily implies that King Lear has already divided the kingdom, at least in two, and has put forth a meticulous effort to make sure that one partition is no better or worse than the other. It also demonstrates that some members of the court, such as Kent and Gloucester, are already privy to this information. This interpretation completely changes the dynamic that follows it. The king, instead of being negligent and leaving deciding the issue of succession simply based on who has the better wordsmithing in their speech, has already carefully considered the inheritance and wants simply to have the affirmation of his daughter's affections. I think this helps King Lear's character arc, as it initially paints him as a prudent and intelligent ruler rather than a whimsical and irresolute one. Scene 2 opens with Edmund contemplating the injustice of him being looked down upon as a bastard, being second to his legitimate brother Edgar. Edmund believes himself to be better and a worthier inheritor of his father's titles and privileges and forms a cunning plot to make it so. His speech regarding this is very interesting, and I especially love how he draws superiority in the fact that he was conceived with more composition and fierce quality in the lusty stealth of nature instead of a dull, stale, tired bed. He later declares that, "Let me, if not by birth, have lands by wit." The parallel here is pretty obvious. King Lear has 3 daughters, each vying for their share of the inheritance, while Edmund does the same upon his father. Edmund actually forges a letter signed by his legitimate brother Edgar, conspiring to kill Gloucester and claim the inheritance. Edmund fumbles with this letter in front of his father so that it's noticed, and putting on an act, he reluctantly hands it over. Edmund's goal is accomplished as Gloucester now believes that his legitimate son is plotting his demise out of sheer greed. Gloucester exits the scene after declaring that the recent eclipses have predicted the current turmoils and much more to come. Once again alone, Edmund mocks his father's superstitions by saying, "This is the excellent foppery of the world, that when we are sick in fortune, often the surfeits of our own behavior, we make guilty of our disasters the sun, the moon, and the stars, as if we were villains by necessity, fools by heavenly compulsion, knaves, thieves, and treacherers by spherical predominance, drunkards, liars, and adulterers by an enforced obedience of planetary influence, and all that we are evil in by a divine thrusting on." I think that this serves to contrast the honorable with the pragmatists. In this case, Edmund acts not in honor and does not leave his destiny in the hands of fate. Instead, he mocks fate and plots to forge his own path in life, acting upon it with pragmatic determination. The same can be said about King Lear and his daughters. Cordelia maintains her honor, while her 2 sisters find a way to further their own goals with some rational prudence. While Cordelia loves her father unconditionally, she refuses to indulge him in what she sees as a false display. Meanwhile, though, Goneril and Regan may not like their father as much, but they are more than happy to play the part and recite eloquent declarations of love. Edgar enters the scene and is told by Edmund that their father is extremely angry. Edmund suggests that his brother hide until temper's cool, and the cause of Gloucester's anger may be disproven. Edmund is clearly playing both sides here as part of his plot. Scene 3 is very brief. Goneril complains that her father and his retinue of 100 knights are terrible guests at her home and are causing her a great deal of distress. Frustrated, she tells her attendant Oswald that she will not see her father when he returns from hunting and that everyone should treat the guests very coldly. Scene 4 opens with Kent disguising himself so that he can remain in the kingdom after his exile. King Lear enters and interrogates him, not recognizing Kent for who he really is. Kent desires employment with the king so that he can continue to serve him faithfully, and the king finds that, upon returning from his hunt, Goneril's household is indeed treating him very coldly, and as such, one of his attendants observes, "My lord, I know not what the matter is, but to my judgment your highness is not entertained with that ceremonious affection as you were wont. There's great abatement of kindness appears as well in the general dependents, as in the duke himself also, and your daughter." Oswald, Goneril's main attendant, returns and addresses the king as my lady's father instead of king, and this confers a huge offense. Kent demonstrates his loyalty by tripping Oswald and then pushing him out. The king's fool enters the scene, and it's important to explore some of the historical context before discussing this character in greater length. Fools, or jesters in the time of Shakespeare, were an important part of the royal court. They served essentially as multi-talented entertainers. They were often given some immunity from punishment for their words and actions, and were therefore able to speak truth to power in a way that others in the court might not have been able to do so. In this way, fools could offer a critical perspective on the events and personalities of the court, and they could serve as a source of valuable insight and commentary on the current events and the court gossip. And this is the exact role that the fool plays in King Lear. He bursts into a tease, suggesting that King Lear should wear his coxcomb, which is a fool's hat, for the foolish actions of banishing Cordelia and giving away his kingdom to Goneril and Regan. He then offers advice in the form of poetic wisdom. Have more than thou showest, speak less than thou knowest, lend less than thou owest, ride more than thou goest, learn more than thou trowest, set less than thou throwest, leave thy drink and thy whore, and keep in a door, and thou shalt have more than 2/10 to a score. The dynamic exchange between the fool and the king in this scene is very interesting. It's as if the fool is an outside observer who can speak truth of the matter. In his shadow, every other character of the play appears to be playing the part through deceit or are completely blind to the events unfolding. In this way, I think that the fool appears almost omniscient. It's fun to see how he pushes the truth of his opinions to the king while being very careful as to not overly offend. He even goes as far as saying, I am better than thou art now. I am a fool. Thou art nothing. Goneril enters and confronts her father on the permissive attitudes of a rowdy and misbehaving retinue of knights. The fool is quick to point out the offense of a daughter speaking up against her father with a brilliant line. For you know, nuncle, the hedge sparrow fed the cuckoo so long that its head bit off by it young. Goneril and Lear engage in an argument, and the latter takes great offense at the suggestion that he should cut the size of his retinue. In heated anger, the king vows to leave the place and declares that he has at least one daughter left, referring to Regan. Interestingly, he begins to recognize for the first time that perhaps he was too hard on Cordelia in the first scene of the play. He says, O small fault, how ugly didst thou in Cordelia show, which like an engine wrenched my frame of nature from the fixed place, drew from my heart all love, and added to the gall, striking his head. O Lear, 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 beat at this gate and let thy folly in, and thy dear judgment out. He then curses his daughter, who has dismissed half or 50 of his knights, out of secret fear that the king may again wield power against real or perceived offenses. She's trying to further sap the king of his power and has done so. In addition, she sent a letter to her sister Regan to describe the events which have occurred. Another important thing to note about the scene is that it demonstrates the king is beginning to realize a new role. He once was a king that had wielded power with authority, but now having given away his kingdom, his authority is only a shadow of what it once was. In the concluding scene of Act 1, the king and fool again have a dialogue as they prepare to depart to the Palace of Albany. It is much more of the same in that the fool continues to point out the follies of the king and preach him wisdom. A couple of lines specifically stand out to me of this discussion. If thou wert my fool, nuncle, I'd have thee beaten for being old before thy time. How's that? Thou shouldest not have been old till thou hadst been wise. Act 1 closes with the king departing Albany with his retinue, and Act 2 opens in Gloucester's castle with a servant informing Edmund that there are rumors of a possible war between the Dukes of Albany and Cornwall, and that the latter is on his way with his wife Regan. Edmund advises Edgar that his hiding spot has been compromised and begs him to flee before Gloucester's guards can apprehend him. Edmund purposely wounds his own arm with a dagger and pretends to have been engaged with Edgar just at that moment, as to give further credence to his lies. Gloucester continues to believe Edmund and promises to make him heir to his lands. Meanwhile, the Duke of Cornwall and Regan arrive and state that Goneril warned them that King Lear was coming to stay with them with his company of unruly knights. They likewise received a letter from King Lear describing his version of events, and therefore Cornwall and Regan fled to the castle of Gloucester to seek his counsel and advice on the matter. Scene 2 opens with Kent and Oswald running into each other at Gloucester's castle. Kent recognizes Oswald as the man who offended King Lear at Goneril's residence and proceeds to insult him, which is worth quoting here simply for the appreciation of it. A knave, a rascal, an eater of broken meat, a base-proud, shallow, beggarly, three-suited, 100-pound, filthy, worsted-stocking knave, a lily-livered, action-taking knave, horse-son, glass-gazing, super-serviceable, finical rogue, one trunk inheriting slave, one that wouldst be a bawd, in a way of good service, and art nothing but the composition of a knave, beggar, coward, pander, and the son and heir of a mongrel bitch, one whom I will beat into clamorous whining if thou deniest the least syllable of thy audition. The Duke of Cornwall, Regan, Gloucester, and several knights enter the scene and attempt to defuse the situation and make sense of it all. Oswald comes out on top and convinces the others that Kent is an offender who assaulted him in Goneril's home and tried again to do so at that very moment. Cornwall has Kent bound up in stocks against the wishes of Gloucester, who sympathizes with the man and the king. At the end of the scene, Kent alludes to a letter from Cordelia that suggests that she will soon come to right the wrongs that have been done. Edgar, having hitherto eluded capture, disguises himself as a madman in the woods in the brief third scene of Act 2. This is the second case of a seemingly righteous character disguising himself in order to avoid persecution. The first, of course, being Kent. In Scene 4, King Lear and his retinue arrive at the courtyard of Gloucester's castle and discover the pitiful Kent bound up in the stocks. And Kent reveals that when he first arrived, he tried to deliver the king's message but was interrupted by Goneril's messenger Oswald. Upon heeding Goneril's warning, Regan and the Duke of Albany came to Gloucester's castle. He then retells how he got into a fight with Oswald. King Lear is outraged at this offense, that his own daughter would bind up the king's messenger in such a humiliating way. As Lear exits to look for his daughter, the fool delivers more wisdom by suggesting that Kent is indeed also a fool for continuing to serve the king when the tides are clearly against him. He implies that self-preservation is wiser than loyalty. He says, "We'll set thee to school to an ant, to teach thee there's no laboring in the winter." This is a reference to the Bible. In Proverbs chapter 6, verses 6 through 8, it says, "Go to the ant, thou sluggard, consider her ways and be wise, which having no guide, overseer, or ruler, provideth her meat in the summer, and gathereth her food in the harvest." The fool is therefore playing off this passage by noting that it's foolish to labor in the winter, or in this case, it's foolish to serve a king on the decline. He continues on to say, "Let go thy hold when a great wheel runs down a hill, lest it break thy neck with following it." He describes human nature and how loyalty is often superficial and self-serving. "That, sir, which serves and seeks for gain, and follows but for form, will pack when it begins to rain, and leave thee in the storm. But I will tarry, the fool will stay, and let the wise man fly. The knave turns fool that runs away, the fool no knave, Purdy." Although he recognizes the folly of holding on to that wheel rolling down a hill, he fulfills his role as fool by remaining loyal to the king while others, more wise, abandon Lear. As Regan and Cornwall enter the scene, King Lear still holds up hope that there has been some sort of grave misunderstanding. He tells Regan of the injustices done to him by Goneril, hoping to garner sympathy and support. Regan takes her sister's side, however, and urges the king to both forgive Goneril and return to her castle under the conditions previously set forth. The king is incredulous, and he begins to break down, quickly realizing that none will take his side and that both of his daughters have turned against him. Goneril and her retinue now enter the scene, and King Lear scolds her. It's worth quoting some of the insults here again because I love these Shakespearean insults. They're great. He tells Goneril, "But yet thou art my flesh, my blood, my daughter, or rather a disease that's in my flesh, which I must needs call mine. Thou art a boil, a plague sore, an embossed carbuncle in my corrupted blood." Another argument between the king and his two daughters breaks out, and the two declare that they will not host him as agreed upon unless he dismiss a great number of his knights. Goneril initially accepted to host only 50 out of the 100, and now Regan says she will host no more than 25. And there's a back and forth, and the number keeps going lower and lower, striking a greater offense to the king each time until each sister agrees that they will host the king, but not one single man more. Outraged, the king curses his daughters and swears revenge upon them. As storm clouds literally and figuratively start to gather, King Lear forsakes any hospitality of his daughters and takes off with his fool and Kent. Gloucester tries to reason with Regan and Cornwall, but they retort, saying that the king has brought his troubles upon himself, abandoning him to the mercy of the storm. "Oh, sir, to willful men, the injuries that they themselves procure must be their schoolmasters. Shut up your doors. He is attended with a desperate train, and what they may incense him to, being apt to have his ear abused, wisdom bids fear. Shut up your doors, my lord. 'Tis a wild night. My Regan counsels well. Come out of the storm." The storm here is symbolic for the fall of grace of King Lear. From mighty king to lowly beggar betrayed by his daughters. Therefore, when Cornwall counsels Gloucester to come out of the storm, he means this literally, but is also advising him to abandon the king, in a similar fashion to which the fool advised Kent at the start of the same scene. And so concludes the first 2 acts of King Lear. The stage is now set for the storm, and next time we will conclude the play and also discuss it in its entirety. As always, be sure to join the book club in the Discord server. Links are in the description. I look forward to discussing this with you guys in there.